turning them on and off and activated some blah blah. Say it nicely, please.
A predisposition for boobs.
No.
Welcome to Totally Unrelated, a place where history, trivia, media, brain farts, and the occasional venting session. My name's Diana.
And I'm Irina.
And this episode we continue our discussion of Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, EuGENE. Irina, care to provide a brief recap of the last episode?
Well, in the first part, we discussed the main outline of the book and the main parts of the book. And we went into more detail about the IQ and IQ testing, all the discussion about intelligence and whether it's heritable and inheritable. And we discussed also a little bit about racial genetics and the fact that the way that race is defined nowadays, especially based on how people self-identify, is not a very scientifically useful way of using this term. And it's definitely not useful for deciding if those people have certain intelligence characteristics, let's say. So that was pretty much it.
So let's move on. Let's continue this quite fascinating book.
Okay, so I mean, Siddhartha Mukherjee definitely is not afraid of hard subjects, because one other idea that Mukherjee tackles from the genetics point of view is identity. I mean, a whole can of worms here.
Yeah, definitely.
So he starts by saying, and I quote, "It is hard to dispute three essential facts: that males and females are anatomically and physiologically different, that these anatomical and physiological differences are specified by genes, and that these differences, interposed against cultural and social constructions of the self, have a potent influence on specifying our identities as individuals."
Okay, so that's sort of a sciencey way of saying that it's not really a case of nature versus nurture, but rather that sort of in the beginning there was nature, and then you have a hefty layer of social expectations which interacts with nature, right? To create the mixture that we come to understand as our identities as men or women, or for those who don't, the identities that don't fit us and we reject or try to redefine, right?
Yes, most definitely. But for the usefulness of what he's trying then to discuss, he mostly tries to separate the steps. He tries to attract attention that it will be a discussion about genotype, that it's one layer, phenotype, that is the next layer, and obviously the cultural influences and all the social constructions that are a third layer, of course. Yeah.
So it's again a case of like onions, layers upon layers, and they all interact to form the onion.
Yeah, who would have thought the onion is so important? Yeah.
The onion is essential.
Totally. After telling the story of how scientists found out about the X and Y chromosome and their importance for sex determinism, Mukherjee points out how small the Y chromosome is. I'm just mentioning this fact because I thought it was funny, the way he presents the situation of the Y chromosome. In genetic terms, this suggests a peculiar paradox. Sex, one of the most complex of human traits, is unlikely to be encoded by multiple genes. Rather, a single gene, buried rather precariously on the Y chromosome, must be the master regulator of maleness. Male readers of the last paragraph should take notice. We barely made it. So I just thought this was funny.
Yeah.
So from here, Mukherjee talks about the hunt for the gene presented on the Y chromosome that determines the male sex characteristics of a person, and how it was found as being the Sry gene.
What is the Sry gene more exactly?
Well, it sounds really intelligent when you say Sry, but it means sex determining region on the Y chromosome.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't actually have a name, so they just shorten it so they can talk about it.
It's basically a description of what it does.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. I think this gene is mostly famous for the condition named Sawyer syndrome. Not that the people know the name Sawyer syndrome, but what it does, where the Sry gene is mutated, and its mutation makes all its carrier females, even if they have a Y chromosome.
Mm-hmm.
After the presentation of these facts, Mukherjee asked the question, if genes determine sexual anatomy so unilaterally, then how do genes affect gender identity? So, to start the conversation of gender and identity, Mukherjee presents some troubling stories from the 70s and the 80s about sexual reassignment, mostly done for children born with ambiguous or underdeveloped genitals, and the cases of these people and how much they suffered due to this idea that existed back then, that you can make somebody identify with a certain gender, like for real, just by applying enough pressure from outside. So it was this idea that nature was everything, made pretty clear the fact that gender identity was not exclusively the result of social conditioning.
You mean just by applying pressure from the outside sounds more like nurture to me, like.
Yeah, sorry. Did I say nature?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's why I was a bit confused.
Sorry. So these case reports finally put to rest the assumption, still unshakably prevalent in some circles at the time, that gender identity can be created or programmed entirely, or even substantially, by training, suggestion, behavioral enforcement, social performance, or cultural intervention. Isn't it funny to think that just like a couple of decades ago, people thought you could be female or male just by, snapping of fingers?
Now people are the sheer willpower.
Yeah. And now people are like, no, the influences of the outside have no bearing. And I'm like, why can't we just, have a normal discussion?
People are wonderfully inconsistent, consistent with their inconsistency, so to speak. Because like you said, they were on the one hand subjecting their children to gender corrective surgeries, right? Because that was the term.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They corrected nature, the arrogance of the whole gesture. So, they did the corrective surgery, and then, they just relied on the fact that, well, if we bring the kid up as, I don't know, a boy or a girl, and we dress them like that, and everyone treats them like that because we have given him or her gendered name, everything will pan out perfectly. But as you said, the same people, well, I mean, not like on an individual basis necessarily, but it's usually the same.
On the whole.
Yeah. They also don't see a contradiction in then dismissing people who are either queer, non-binary, transgender, who would say that, well, it's not all about genes and chromosomes when it comes to how you identify, because obviously, depending on the society and how it shapes you as an individual, you might reject certain labels, you might embrace some of them, you might play around with them. Like, no, they shout, it's all about biology. Let's just check your chromosomes, but.
Yeah, and not even all about biology. Now it's all about genotype. Yeah. Like, we don't even care now about phenotype. That, anyway.
Yeah.
So it is now clear that genes are vastly more influential than virtually any other force in shaping sex identity and gender identity. although in limited circumstances, a few attributes of gender can be learned through cultural, social, and hormonal reprogramming. And how we reconcile this idea of a single genetic switch that dominates one of the most profound dichotomies in human identity with the fact that human gender identity in the real world appears to be on a continuous spectrum.
Ah, there you go, trying to justify all 67 genders.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, in genetic terms, though, there is no contradiction, Mukherjee says. He says that master switches and hierarchical organization of genes are perfectly compatible with continuous curves of behavior, identity, and physiology, and that the Sry gene controls sex determination in an on and off manner. And you turn Sry on and an animal becomes anatomically and physiologically male. Turn it off and the animal becomes anatomically and physiologically female. Sry must act on a dozen of targets. And then he goes on to explain that in order to enable more profound aspects of gender determination and gender identity, Sry must act on a dozen of targets, turning them on and off, activating some genes and repressing others, like a relay race that moves a baton from hand to hand. So these genes in turn integrate inputs from the self and from the environment, from hormones, from behavior, from exposures, from social performances, from cultural role-playing, and from memory. And this whole thing makes gender. What we call gender, then, is actually an elaborate genetic and developmental cascade with Sry at the top of the hierarchy and the modifiers and integrators and instigators and interpreters below. And this developmental cascade specifies gender identity. So, to turn to an earlier analogy, genes are single lines in a recipe that specifies gender. The Sry gene in the first line of the recipe always. Like start with 4 cups of flour, since we were talking about food. If you fail to start with flour, you will certainly not bake anything close to a cake. But infinite variation fan out of that first line, like from crusty baguette of the French bakery to the mooncake of Chinatown and other desserts that I'm sure I don't know.
So basically, to put this into biological language, so you first start off with the Sry gene being activated if you are to eventually end up with someone who would be male. But in order for them to identify...
a whole person. In order for them to be a whole person. Because I was saying, in order for them to be a whole person, not just a dick, you need... You need for the cascade that starts with Sry to activate a whole ton of things that, well, actually... I don't think we know all of them. And you end up with everything that a person is and feels about being male and maleness and femaleness, let's say, or anything in between.
It's this is another one of those interesting things that I found when I would talk to people. Again, in a sort of subconscious level, people do grasp some of these things, but when you try to put it in actual terms, they will, if you use charged language, so to speak, they will just go, no, this is not a thing, this is just bogus. But if you, for instance, tell them things like, okay, so, how would you define a man in contrast with a woman? Things like a primary sexual characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics, and then you start to sort of ask questions. Okay, but like most men on average are taller than most women on average, right? But, a particularly short man, he's still a man, right? Yeah. Okay, so there are men with micro penises. Are they still men? Yeah. Okay, there are men who suffer accidents.
Men who have,
suffer accidents
due to surgery or accidents.
Are they still men? Yes. Okay. So, for instance, someone who identifies as a woman has everything that, you can see with the naked eye looks like a female, but then perhaps at one point in their life she discovers that, oh well, as you said, the Sawyer syndrome was what it was called.
Yeah.
So they have a Y chromosome. Are they a man now? You know, so these are things that people, they do acknowledge that it's a bit more complicated. It's very much a question of how you sort of frame the discussion, and that will just make them admit to what they already sort of know anyhow.
And
or not.
What I found funny in some of these discussions was that, of course, they were agreeing with these instances, but then they go on and say like, but these are particular circumstances. And I always tell them, but we do talk about a minority of people being on, this spectrum that is maybe in between. Most people are quite in sync with everything. So yeah, it is about very particular instances. That's what we're talking about.
And also sort of majorities are made up of people who are the minority in other ways. Like, for instance, okay, so you have the majority of, I don't know, say straight people who are also made up of individuals who are colorblind, who are a minority in other ways, you know. People who are in a given context, maybe, I don't know, they have different disabilities, who are also a minority. So it's like everyone, if you choose a particular context, is a minority. So just this idea that, oh, well, they are just, you know, they are extreme cases, they are just oddities, or everyone is odd, everyone is a little bit odd, or is a minority, or is, you know, particular in their own way, depending on what we're talking about. So it's just weird to just say, well, yeah, but we shouldn't talk about this because it's the exception.
Yeah, sure, there are lots of exceptions, just that some of them seem to some people more exceptional than others.
Yeah, because they are less familiar.
They are less familiar, and most of the times they are also, laced with this or intermingled with ideas of politics or religion, or, this kind of things. Anyway, so Mukherjee explains this complex system, this whole hierarchy very well. So I will not try to summarize it, but I will read it in its entirety because I thought it was, so well said. As I said in the first part, I think the writing of this book is really good. Like, he really has a way with words. So here goes. Genes that govern gender identity are hierarchically organized, starting with SRI on top and then fanning out into thousands of rivulets of information below, which means that, Mukherjee says, whether nature predominates or nurture is not absolute, but depends quite acutely on the level of organization one chooses to examine. At the top of the cascade, nature works forcefully and unilaterally. Up top, gender is quite simple, just one master gene flicking on and off. At the bottom of the network, in contrast, a purely genetic view fails to perform. It does not provide a particularly sophisticated understanding of gender or its identity. Here, in the estuarine plains of crisscrossing information, history, society, and culture collide and intersect with genetics like tides. Some waves cancel each other while others reinforce each other. No force is particularly strong, but their combined effect produces the unique and rippled landscape that we called an individual's identity.
Yeah, you're right. He has a way with words. But just to see if I understood this correctly. So
yeah,
the SRY gene acts like a switch in binary choice 1 or 0, but it has to then act upon a whole host of different things to give rise to an individual sense of identity, like you said, in order to have a man, not just a dick.
Yeah.
And then the cascade he describes that flows from that initial switch refers to variations at which levels more exactly? So is it also like secondary sexual characteristics?
Yes, of course. It's an on and off switch for primary and secondary characteristics. But then it flows from there to all levels that honestly I couldn't manage to actually start and retell them here. So it's genuinely it's too intricate, and I think if he were to write about this, I think he would end up with a whole other book. So basically you start with just one thing, but then that acts on the next level, like on hormones, on facial characteristics, and how the level of muscle versus the level of
blubber.
Let's say blubber, the level of fat. Then, for example, the level of fat and the level of hormones have later in life determined, let's say, the fact that women have a bigger predisposition towards, I don't know, I cannot find the nice way to say, now you said blubber and now I only come up with boobs instead of, say it nicely, please.
A predisposition for boobs.
No, come on, say the...
I mean, I do have that, but...
I was trying to say that the fact that us as women have more fat than muscle, and this will always be true, also has an influence on the diseases we have later in life.
Like breast cancer, for instance.
Like breast cancer, exactly, not boob cancer. So yeah, there are layers upon layers of things that, as he said, interact with each other. So it is quite silly actually to try and be like, no, everything has to do with the first on and off switch. But it is also obviously, as the experiments in the 70s and 80s, it was not only stupid but monstrous to also insist that, well, we will ignore this completely and just put a dress on, and then like, there you go, you'll be a little girl now. Well, not you, obviously. Moving on. In this chapter, Mukherjee also discusses a point that I think it's worth mentioning, and that is why sexual reproduction was invented at all. I mean, invented as a way of saying, not like anybody sat down and was like, what are we inventing today?
That's truly innovative.
Yeah, so most evolutionary biologists agree that sex was created to enable rapid genetic reassortment. So no quicker way exists, perhaps, to mix genes from two organisms than by mixing their eggs and sperm. And even the genesis of spermatozoa and egg cells causes genes to shuffle through the gene recombination. So the powerful reassortment of genes during sexual reproduction increases variation, and variation in turn increases an organism's fitness and survival ability. So the phrase sexual reproduction then is the perfect misnomer, because the evolutionary purpose of sex is not reproduction. Organisms can make superior facsimiles of reproduction, superior facsimiles of themselves, in the absence of sex. The sex was invented for quite the opposite reason, to enable recombination. But sexual reproduction and sexual determination are not the same thing. And even if we recognize many advantages of sexual reproduction, we might still ask why most mammals use the XY system for gender determination. Why, in short, the why? Why?
Why even man?
Yeah. Why even man? And apparently the answer is we don't know, or beats me. So I think this frustrates a lot of people that we cannot actually answer that. So, of course, the tour de force of all these things really bother some people, and would not have been completed. This whole idea of discussion, things that bother people, without discussion. Sexual identity.
Of course.
So a lot of work has been put into finding the gay gene. And alas, the work
We've been
did not pan
looking and
out.
searching and looking and searching behind the cupboard, behind the pillows.
In really dark places, let's say. And alas, the work did not pan out the way the scientists, like Michael J. Bailey and Dean Hammer, these were the first people that started looking for them, hoped. And these people being the first to look for the gay gene. And I must say a funny story about Dean Hammer.
A very ominous name.
Yes, and he was gay himself. And but he did not start looking for the genetic link to sexuality because his desire to understand himself or something like that. It was because he was incredibly bored with his current at the time research and felt like doing something more adventurous. And apparently, at least sometime, boredom is, more powerful than activism or something like that.
He was a scientific edgelord.
Not even that. He was in the book. It is described at length that he really wasn't seeing himself as going much further in what he was researching at the time. And he went to some conference and he was like, "Oh, this sounds like a subject. If I start, researching into this, people will be interested, and
this will turn heads."
Yes, exactly. So anyway, back to the gay gene, which has not been found. The studies so far, especially the ones on twins, clearly suggest that several determinants that influence sexual identity are part of the human genome. And as geneticists discover more powerful methods to map, identify, and categorize genes, they will inevitably find some of these determinants. But unlike gender, sexual identity, even if its determinants are going to be hierarchically organized, is unlikely to be governed by a single master regulator. So it looks unlikely that we will find an SRY gene but for straightness, So the way things look, multiple genes are involved with small effects, with a lot of them modulating and integrating inputs from the environment.
Oh, damn it, woman. I mean, people want to know what makes the gays gay so they can put a stop to it. In all seriousness, there is, of course, a scientific merit to learning more about this, but I think most gay people... I'm not purporting to be talking in the name of every gay person everywhere, but I think that unless the way being gay has an influence on individuals' life and quality of life, so to speak, many people wouldn't necessarily be that interested. Many gay people wouldn't necessarily be interested in the scientific purely for the scientific merit of the idea. But, it's the sort of topic that is very valuable rhetorically, and it does get picked up and distorted to invalidate gay people's existence. So that, there you go. We have to be interested in this.
So it's pretty much that it has no real bearing on actual lives, except for how the assholes use the notion.
Exactly.
Okay. The book then goes on to show that a lot of what we might think of as profoundly personal choices and particularly special to just us are in fact highly linked with our genetic map. And Mukherjee says if we accept that variation in genes can influence diffuse aspects of human pathology, then we can hardly be astonished that variation in genes can also influence equally diffuse aspects of normalcy. So there is a fundamental symmetry to the idea that the mechanism by which genes cause disease is precisely analogous to the mechanism by which genes cause normal behavior and development,
There is I think, if I remember correctly, there is this equivalent in terms of in terms of sociology to this, where I think it was Foucault who Michel Foucault, who highlighted the fact that when you sort of defined what the deviant was, whether you're talking about homosexual, whether you're talking about people with mental illnesses, that's when you actually did the legwork in defining what normalcy was as well, because that's when you need to have very sharply drawn categories that you want to put people in.
But what Mukherjee tries to tell here is not necessarily that you define disease in contrast with what you define as normal, and that sometimes is just like a label you put on something, but the fact that people very easily accept the idea that when you talk about disease, that genes have this influence on very diffuse aspects, and they don't deny that when you talk about them, about disease. But then when you tell them, well, the same idea that you agree with now when we talk about disease, it's actually the same way it works with normalcy. And that is why we have these, things that are very complex, and you cannot, when it's about normalcy, it's like, no, it's straightforward, or it's A and B. No.
Maybe do you think this has something to do with the fact that, not all cultures, but certainly in Europe and probably in the Northern Hemisphere, a lot of cultures still have this idea of the separation between the material, the bodily, and the mental, the spiritual, the whatever you want to call it, the soul. And of course, the language is less religiously charged now, but the core concept is probably still lingering, that we find it harder to accept that things that are a bit more immaterial than, as you said, you can pinpoint to a disease, you can describe it quite clearly and precisely, and you can trace its origins and the way it moves through the body, but it's a bit more difficult with something like, I don't know, identity or
sexual orientation, as we were talking about. Yeah,
although that moves through the body as well, in different ways.
Yes, I mean, if only we think in how many movies and books and, we find this discussion and story about discovering your true self. That is definitely an idea that makes, in the heads of many people, even if they don't necessarily think about it, they have this impression that there is a you that is somewhere inside the flesh. And somehow you have to like search for it, and then the whole of you will be there for somehow also you to access it, no. No. You are the whole thing, together with your body and your everyday experiences and with everything that happens to you every day, and your inner you, or whatever true you, it will be one today, and it will change according to everything that happened to you over 10 years, or But yeah, it's a lot harder to accept.
It is because it's like every part is a moving part, so it's so unsettling, I think, for a lot of people to just think that there is no fixed point in their life, not just in their life, but in their very being, that they can point to and say, that's my rock.
Yes, and also because this idea of that's who I am, or that's the thing I'm made for, that's my whatever true thing is in their mind, somehow is that is very closely related to the idea that if you reach that, if you find that, then you'll be happy, and then everything will be well, and if that does not exist, it means that it's like this perpetual thing of becoming and becoming, maybe the thing that is not necessarily the most useful for you, But
fundamentally, the conclusion is that we are lazy, because this is why it's so scary to think that you cannot just have the one thing that you can find and then the work is done.
Everything, the work is done. Pretty much.
We do the same with politics as well, right? Because we pick a side and we say, this is the right way to do things. Although, history and experience shows us again and again that however good things look on paper, and they might work for a time as you anticipated, things evolve and people will look for loopholes, or even if they don't, then you will have changing circumstances, and then something that you expected to produce certain results will start producing different results. And,
Absolutely.
This is how, entropy. Things slowly fall apart one way or another. And the best answer, I suppose, is to just constantly, check your results, check what you're getting out of your input, and then make adjustments. But that implies, being there, being present, working. It's tiring.
Yes, and a lot of insecurity also. Moving on with the book, Mukherjee says that genes can describe the form or fate of a complex organism in likelihoods and probabilities, but they cannot accurately describe the form or fate itself. Again, a way of, I think, very nicely expressing things. So a particular combination of genes, a genotype, might predispose you to a particular configuration, let's say, of a nose or of a personality. But the precise shape or length of the nose that you acquire remains unknowable. So a predisposition cannot be confused with the disposition itself. One is a statistical probability and the other is a concrete reality. So what transforms this predisposition in reality? A great many studies performed over many decades ended up with the same result, and I quote again, unsystematic, idiosyncratic, serendipitous events. So illness, accidents, traumas, triggers, a missed train, a lost key, a suspended thought, fluctuations in molecules that cause fluctuations in genes, resulting in slight alteration in forms. I really like this one. So one of the play on words in this book goes like this: being happened through being. I don't know if not...
This is very Heidegger-like language. Being by being by being.
But it's one of those things that it's most definitely looks better written than said out loud. But I thought it was so, very descriptive.
The process of being, the process of existing.
Exactly. So genes must carry out programmed responses to environments. Otherwise, there would be, no concert form. But they must also leave exactly enough room for the vagaries of chance to stick. And, in popular culture, we call this intersection fate. And we call our responses to it choice. And an upright organism with opposable thumbs is thus built from a script, but also built to go off script. So we call one such unique variant of one such organism a self.
It just dawned on me that there might be more merit than I thought to the expression my friend X, who happens to be gay.
Well, yeah, well, definitely. I mean, if we know that, happens to be woman is a lot more, decided from the beginning, happens to be gay, apparently, yeah. From here, Mukherjee goes on to discuss epigenetics and our ever-expanding knowledge about how to manipulate our own genome. And what I said at the beginning of gene therapy and all of that. And I think that this would be a nice way of ending the running around in this book without, exhausting ourselves in this marathon. because there are a lot of other things that are a lot more sciencey orientated in this book. And I genuinely hope that a lot of people will read it, because it is endlessly fascinating. And I mean, you know, what human is not endlessly fascinated with him or herself, you know?
This is why personality tests and quizzes are so popular. Right?
Yes, indeed. Like, I have to admit taking a few of those myself through the years.
Come on. Of course. Even when you do it ironically, like, oh, yeah, sure, this is stupid, but like, let's take this test.
I took some of them like quite serious, like at some of my workplaces where I was, you know, I had to take a psychological test, but I was like really interested in finding the result. And when the person who was interpreting the test asked me, like, would you like me to tell you more? And I was like, yes, sure. And, you know, from like genuinely somewhat professional and serious things to, you know, silly things that pop up on the internet, that some of them are really like, which Harry Potter character are you most likely to be?
Oh, but I don't know. I've had I think once or twice had to take like sort of I don't know if it would be called a psychological test or a personality test or whatever for a job. And besides the fact that I was kind of off-put by the fact that I had to, given that it was up for a salesperson position in a bakery, like what the fuck. It's weird. But yeah, so besides that, it was just in the context of your employer giving you a psych test, it just seems really weird, because it's almost like the books that tell you how to give a successful interview, where you're supposed to say a certain thing that will be interpreted, you know, like you're supposed to say this because you know this is how they will interpret it. And it just seems so weird. And also this particular test I told you with the bakery, they had a question. I remember this vividly because I was like,
would you ever put poison in the bread?
No, I mean that would have been a commonsensical sort of thing to do, although no one who is crazy like that would actually say yes, I would. But you know, that would have had some merit of maybe seeing if the person has, I don't know, some problems. But there was this question: if one of your coworkers or several of your coworkers does something that goes against the rules, will you A, tell management, B, talk to them, or C, just pretend you didn't see it? And like,
okay.
Yeah, this is such a loaded question, and it's basically, are you going to be a snitch for management? Are you just going to, you know, non-combat, don't interfere, or are you going to be a rubble rouser with the other workers? You know, it's just it really struck me the wrong way. So I was kind of happy when they said, "Oh, you failed the test." I'm like, oh well, great.
Da. I mean, it is. I said da instead of yes. Anyway,
it's fine. You know, I think if we ever have listeners who aren't just our friends, they will probably get to learn a few Romanian words anyhow by, you know, as they listen.
So yeah, I think those sorts of questions, I think not only are they really loaded because they can be interpreted, you know, in a bad way, either or, you know, but I think in real life, it really matters what we're talking about, because this sort of, if you see something, like, okay, if I saw that one time my colleague did not wash their hands when they left from the toilet, yes, I will not go to management, you know. I would be like, you know, you work in a bakery, maybe wash your hands. if then I thought that, I don't know, somebody poured poison in the mold, I would totally go to management screaming, you know. But I think it's very...
But then you find out it was management who planned this all along. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, that's why I hate thought experiments that are not, genuinely anchored in reality, because you can go in either direction just as easily with justification and with examples and with
Not a fan of the trolley experiment.
No, I am not. And after I read a whole freaking book because of one of our friends that was basically trolleology on wheels, I hate it even more now. So.
Maybe you'll do a review for another episode of that book if you're not still angry about it.
Well, we could put it, because it's quite a new book. We can put it in an episode where we talk about all the books I hated last year.
That's definitely a must.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we should wrap up this this freestyling of ours.
Okay, well, after I'll try to wrap it up in a less awkward way than last episode, where we're like, okay, so that's it. I guess bye. So see you. Bye.
Okay.
So, thanks for
be better now.
Yeah, be best. Thanks for anyone who might be listening, and hear you. Listen, be there for the next episode, I guess. Bye.
So I'm saying this was not much better.
Oh, no. Just say bye. Let's wrap this up. Bye.
Bye.